Hey everyone, time to sit back and enjoy a brand new story again, and in this episode we truly have a crazy story for you. As always, the story is based on real events, but in this case, these events continue to occur to this day. Again, please remember to support our efforts in helping destitute animals by liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and listening to the story all the way to the end. These actions help us manipulate the YouTube algorithm so we can generate as much income for this desperate cause as possible. Now let's get right into this incredible story. It was a late afternoon over Easter in Oudtshoorn, a small town in the arid southern Karoo region of South Africa. The late afternoon sun bathed the town in a golden glow, casting long shadows over the quiet streets. The town is known for its ostrich farms, sprawling landscapes, and breathtaking Kango caves. But for Anthony LaGrange, it held something far more precious. His fiancée, Elise. Elise was a picture of grace and warmth, her soft brown eyes always filled with affection whenever she looked at Anthony. They had spent the day exploring the town, wandering through the charming shops and sipping coffee at a small cafe by the roadside. Their conversation was light, filled with the hopes and dreams they shared for the future. They talked about their wedding plans, the house they would buy, and the family they would someday start. But as the sun dipped lower, Anthony knew it was time to leave. He had a long drive ahead of him, and he didn't want to be on the road too late. Elise walked with him to his car, her hand slipping into his as they strolled through the quiet streets. The scent of blooming flowers filled the air, mingling with the distant sounds of birds settling in for the night. Elise expressed her sadness at the prospect of Anthony having to leave, but they both knew the time had come, and he assured her he'll be back soon so they could spend some more time together. Elise nodded in agreement, though the look in her eyes told Anthony she wished for more time. They reached his Volkswagen Beetle, and Anthony turned to her, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. He leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her lips, lingering in the moment as if to carry her warmth with him on the journey ahead. Elise wished him a safe trip in a soft whisper, and Anthony assured her that he would drive extra carefully. As he climbed into the car, Elise waved, her figure growing smaller in the rearview mirror as he pulled away from the curb. The road ahead was long, and the journey back to Cape Town, around a 7-hour drive, would take him through some of the most desolate parts of the Karoo. But Anthony was no stranger to the open road. He found a certain peace in the solitude of the drive. The engine of the Beetle purred as he left Oudtshoorn behind, the town fading into the distance as the landscape opened up before him. The Karoo stretched out endlessly, a vast and barren land where the earth met the sky in a seamless horizon. The road was a narrow strip of asphalt cutting through the rugged terrain, flanked by low bushes and rocky outcrops. Anthony settled into the rhythm of the drive, his thoughts drifting back to Elise and the life they were building together. He smiled to himself, imagining the day when they would no longer have to say goodbye, when their home would be filled with laughter and the pitter-patter of little feet. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the landscape, the mood of the journey began to shift. The warmth of the day gave way to the coolness of evening, and the light took on a golden hue, casting an eerie glow over the land. The Karoo, which had seemed so peaceful just hours before, now felt vast and empty. The road stretched out before him like a ribbon of black tar, winding through the barren wilderness of the Karoo. The sky was a deepening shade of blue, and the first stars were beginning to twinkle in the east. Anthony had driven this road many times before, but tonight something felt different. There was a stillness in the air, a sense of anticipation that made his skin prickle. Anthony shrugged it off, as merely the effects from the sadness of having to leave Elise behind that is starting to get to him. The Karoo is a place of harsh beauty, where life clings to the edges of survival. The bushes are small and scraggly, their leaves a dull green, and the soil dry and cracked, parched by the relentless sun. Here and there, a solitary tree stood, its branches twisted and gnarled, as if it had fought for every inch of its existence. As the daylight faded, the shadows lengthened, and the road ahead seemed to grow narrower. The headlights of the Beetle battled through the gathering darkness, illuminating only the asphalt ahead. The sound of the engine was the only thing that broke the silence, a steady hum that vibrated through the car and into Anthony's bones. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was just after 7, and he still had several hours of driving ahead of him. He knew the road well enough to navigate it in the dark, but the idea of spending so much time alone on this desolate stretch of highway was always a concern to him. The Karoo has a way of making a man feel small, insignificant against the vastness of the landscape. As the miles ticked by, Anthony found his thoughts drifting back to Elise. He imagined her at home in Oudtshoorn, perhaps reading a book or preparing for bed. The thought of her warmth and comfort brought a smile to his face. but it was quickly replaced by a shiver of unease. He had always been a rational man, grounded in the real world, but something about this night felt different. The sky was now a deep indigo, and the stars were out in full force, twinkling like diamonds scattered across a velvet backdrop. The moon had yet to rise, and the darkness seemed to press in on all sides, turning the road into a narrow tunnel of light. Anthony felt the weight of the night closing in around him, the vast emptiness of the Karoo stretching out into infinity. As he approached the Baranda's turnoff, the road began to wind through a series of low hills, the terrain growing more rugged. The headlights of the Beetle cast long shadows across the landscape, turning the bushes and rocks into eerie shapes that seemed to move in the corner of his eye. Anthony shook his head, trying to dispel the strange feeling that had settled over him. It was then that he saw her. A figure appeared in the distance, standing by the side of the road. At first, Anthony thought it was a trick of the light, but as he drew closer, he could see her more clearly. She was a young woman, her long dark hair blowing in the breeze. She wore a dark coat that reached down to her knees, the fabric heavy and old-fashioned. She stood perfectly still, her arms hanging at her sides, her gaze fixed on something far off in the distance. Anthony's heart began to race. What was a woman doing out here, alone on this desolate stretch of road? His first instinct was to stop and offer her a ride, but something held him back. There was something about her that didn't seem quite right, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He slowed the car as he approached her, the headlights illuminating her face. She was pale, almost ghostly, her features delicate and refined. Her eyes were dark, and there was a sadness in them that seemed to reach out and grab hold of Anthony's heart. He found himself unable to look away, his gaze locked on hers as if drawn by some invisible force. Without thinking, Anthony pulled the car to a stop beside her. The woman turned her head slowly to look at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence between them thick with unspoken tension. "Do you need a ride?" Anthony asked, his voice sounding strange in the stillness of the night. The woman didn't respond right away. She seemed to be considering his offer, her dark eyes searching his face as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. Finally, she gave a small nod and stepped forward. As she opened the passenger door, she pulled the lever on the side of the passenger seat, tilted the backrest forward, and stepped over to take a position in the back seat behind the front passenger seat. Anthony stared at her for a second, not quite sure why she wouldn't get into the front passenger seat, but then decided she must feel safer there than right beside him. So he tilted the backrest of the front seat back into its upright position and reached over to close the passenger door. As soon as she was inside the car, the temperature seemed to drop. Anthony felt a chill run down his spine, the cold seeping into his bones despite the warmth of the engine. A strange scent he could not place filled the air, a delicate fragrance that seemed out of place in the harsh landscape of the Karoo. In as polite a way as Anthony knew how, he asked her where she was heading, and she replied in a murmuring voice completely devoid of any emotion that she was heading just up the road. Again, this perplexed Anthony, as to his recollection there was nothing but rugged Karoo veldt for a number of miles before they got to the small town of Uniondale. But, he thought, maybe there was a farmhouse off the road that he had just never taken notice of up ahead. So he nodded in agreement, put the car in gear, and pulled back onto the road. The woman sat in silence over his left shoulder, her hands folded in her lap. For reference, people in South Africa drive on the left side of the road, so the steering wheel is on the right side of the car. She stared straight ahead, her gaze fixed on the road as if she knew exactly where they were going. The coldness in the car was almost unbearable, and Anthony found himself shivering despite himself. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, trying to make sense of the situation. There was something about her that didn't add up, something that made him question whether she was even real. Her presence was both unsettling and mesmerizing, and he found himself drawn to her in a way that defied logic. The road wound through the hills, the landscape growing more and more desolate with each passing mile. The darkness seemed to press in on all sides, the stars overhead offering little comfort. On a few occasions, Anthony tried to make conversation, but the woman's responses were brief and cryptic, offering no insight into who she was or why she was out here in the middle of nowhere. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Anthony couldn't take the silence any longer. He was about to turn to ask her a question when she let out the most spine-chilling, shriek-like scream Anthony has ever heard. In reaction to this, Anthony's arms and shoulders instinctively lifted, while he tucked his head in between them and slightly away from her to escape the sound. The scream lasted only a second or two, and when she stopped, Anthony flung himself around at her with an expression that showed a mixture of confusion and anger. But as he did, he realized with a jolt that the back seat was completely empty. The woman had vanished, leaving no trace behind. The cold air still clung to the inside of the car, and the faint scent he couldn't place lingered in the air, but she was gone. Anthony must have frozen in a moment of disbelief, because the next second, he had to wrestle the wheel of the Beetle to keep it from careening off the road and into the felt on the left of the tarmac. Once Anthony had avoided crashing and regained control, he violently brought the Beetle to a stop in the middle of the road and whipped around again to check himself. But despite a split second of belief that she played a prank on him, he was instantly horrified to find that what he had seen a moment ago was real. She was nowhere. Panic seized Anthony's heart as he frantically searched the car, his hands shaking as he reached for the gear lever. He pulled over to the side of the road, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. How could she have disappeared so suddenly? There had been no sound, no movement, nothing to suggest that she had ever been there at all. His breath came in ragged gasps as he sat in the driver's seat, his mind reeling. He tried to convince himself that it had all been a hallucination, a trick of the light or his overactive imagination. But the coldness in the car, her scent, and the memory of her sad, dark eyes were all too real. Anthony sat there for what felt like hours, trying to gather his thoughts. The road stretched out before him, empty and silent, the darkness closing in around him. He knew he couldn't stay here forever, but the thought of driving on, alone in the night, filled him with a deep sense of dread. Finally, he forced himself to start the car and continue on to Uniondale. His hands trembled on the steering wheel, his eyes darting to the passenger seat every few seconds, half expecting to see the woman sitting there again. But the seat remained empty, and the road stretched on, leading him deeper into the night. When Anthony finally reached Uniondale, it was well past midnight. The small town was eerily quiet, the streets deserted and the houses dark. The only sign of life was the faint glow of a street lamp outside the police station, casting a pool of light on the cracked pavement. Anthony parked his car and sat for a moment staring at the station. His heart was still pounding, his mind racing with the events of the night. He had no idea what he was going to say, how he was going to explain what had happened. But he knew he couldn't just drive on as if nothing had happened. He needed answers. Besides, what if, in a way that he couldn't explain, she had jumped out of the moving car and was now lying on the side of the road badly injured? He had to report this. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and made his way to the station. The cold night air bit at his skin, and he wrapped his coat tighter around himself as he approached the door. He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the handle, before finally pushing it open and stepping inside. The interior of the station was dimly lit, the walls lined with old photographs and faded wanted posters. A single desk lamp illuminated the figure of Constable Cornelius Potgieter, who was leaning back in his chair with a cup of coffee in hand. He looked up as Anthony entered, his bushy mustache twitching as he regarded the newcomer with mild curiosity. "Can I help you?" Constable Cornelius asked, his voice gruff, but not unkind. Anthony hesitated, unsure of how to begin. He had no idea how to explain what had happened, how to make sense of the impossible encounter he had just experienced, but he knew he had to try. I need to report something," Anthony stammered, his voice shaky. "Something strange." Potgieter raised an eyebrow, setting his coffee cup down on the desk. "Strange, you say? What kind of strange?" Anthony took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I was driving from Outshorn to Cape Town and I picked up a hitchhiker. A woman. But then she just disappeared." Potgieter's expression remained neutral as he listened, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Disappeared, you say? How exactly did she disappear?" Anthony shook his head, his hands trembling as he tried to explain. "I don't know. One moment she was there, sitting in the passenger seat, and then she was gone. Just like that." For a moment, Potgieter said nothing, his gaze fixed on Anthony as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Then, with a slow nod, he leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You're not the first to report something like this. There's a story about a young woman, Maria Roux, who died on that road years ago. Since then, there have been reports of people seeing her, picking her up, and then, well, just as you described, she disappears." Anthony felt a chill run down his spine as Potgieter spoke. The rational part of his mind struggled to accept what he was hearing, but the memory of the woman's sad eyes and the coldness that had filled the car was too vivid to dismiss. "Do you believe in ghosts, Constable?" Anthony asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Potgieter shrugged, his mustache twitching as he considered the question. "I've seen a lot of things in my time, things that can't always be explained. Whether or not you believe in ghosts, there's something out there on that road, something that doesn't belong in this world." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Potgieter's words hanging in the air. Finally, the constable leaned forward, his expression serious. "Let's go back, I'll come with you, and we'll take a look. Maybe we'll find something that'll help us understand what happened." Anthony hesitated, the thought of returning to that desolate stretch of road filling him with dread. But he knew he couldn't just leave it at that. He needed to know what had happened, needed to find some kind of explanation, even if it was one he didn't want to hear. With a nod, he agreed, and the two men set out into the night, the cold wind whipping through the streets as they made their way back to Anthony's car. The drive back to the site of the encounter was tense, the weight of what they were about to face hanging heavily in the air. Potgieter sat beside Anthony in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He didn't speak, and Anthony was grateful for the silence, his own thoughts too chaotic to put into words. The road was just as desolate as before, the darkness pressing in on all sides as the car wound its way through the hills. The stars overhead seemed cold and distant, offering little comfort against the oppressive night. Anthony's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. Finally, they reached the spot where Anthony had seen the woman. He pulled the car to a stop, his heart pounding in his chest as he stared at the empty stretch of road. The memory of the encounter was still fresh in his mind. The coldness, her scent, the way her eyes had seemed to look straight into his soul. Potgieter stepped out of the car, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he began to search the area. Anthony followed, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps as he scanned the surroundings. The night was deathly silent, the only sound the soft rustle of the wind through the bushes. They searched the area thoroughly, their footsteps crunching on the gravel as they moved through the underbrush. But there was nothing, no footprints, no disturbed earth, nothing to suggest that anyone had been here at all. Anthony felt a growing sense of frustration and fear as they searched, the reality of what had happened becoming more and more impossible to deny. He had seen her, had spoken to her, had felt her presence in the car. But now, standing here in the cold night air, it was as if she had never existed. Potgieter paused, his flashlight beam fixed on a spot by the side of the road. Anthony hurried over, his heart racing with anticipation. But when he reached the spot, he saw nothing but a small patch of disturbed earth. The constable knelt down, examining the ground closely. "It's hard to say for sure, but this looks like it could be where someone was standing," Potgieter said, his voice low. "But there's not much to go on." Anthony's shoulders slumped in defeat. He had hoped that coming back here would provide some answers, but instead, he felt more lost than ever. The encounter with the woman had shaken him to his core. And now, with no explanation in sight, the fear and uncertainty were beginning to take their toll. Potgieter stood up, his expression grim. "We might not find anything tonight, but that doesn't mean nothing happened. I believe you, Anthony, and I'll do what I can to help you find some answers." The words were a small comfort, but they did little to dispel the gnawing fear that had taken root in Anthony's heart. He nodded, his throat too tight to speak, and the two men made their way back to the car. As they drove back to Uniondale, the silence between them was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Anthony couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the woman's presence still lingered somewhere in the darkness, just out of sight. The cold air pressed in on him, and the woman's strange scent seemed to cling to his car, a ghostly reminder of the encounter that had turned his world upside down. Back in Uniondale, Anthony decided not to drive any further, and to rather book himself into the local inn for the night. However, after unpacking everything he would need for the night, Anthony couldn't sleep. The events of the night replayed in his mind over and over, each detail etched into his memory with a vividness that defied logic. He tossed and turned in the small bed throughout the night, the thin sheets offering little comfort against the cold that seemed to seep into his very bones. When dawn finally broke, he rose from the bed, bleary-eyed and exhausted, but determined to find some answers. He knew he couldn't just walk away from this, couldn't go back to his life in Cape Town without understanding what had happened on that road. He decided to start by learning more about Maria Roux, the woman Potgieter had mentioned. The story of her tragic death had intrigued him, and he hoped that by uncovering more about her past, he might find some clue that would explain her ghostly appearance. Uniondale was a small town, and it didn't take long for Anthony to find someone who knew about Maria. The woman explained to Anthony that Maria was a lovely girl, full of life and laughter. At the time she died, she was deeply in love and engaged to be married to her fiancé, Gilles Grobelar. The couple's future seemed bright as they planned their life together in the close-knit community of Uniondale. However, on a cold and fateful Easter weekend in 1968, as they drove along the winding road between Uniondale and Willowmore, their lives took a tragic turn. Gilles, who was behind the wheel, lost control of the car on a particularly treacherous stretch of road. The vehicle veered off course and flipped over, throwing Maria from the car. She died instantly from the impact, leaving Gil devastated and forever haunted by the accident. Maria's untimely death left a deep void in the hearts of those who knew her, and over the years, stories began to emerge of her ghostly presence, forever tied to the road where her life was so tragically cut short. Some say she's looking for her fiancé, that she doesn't know she's dead, Mrs. van der Merwe said, her eyes distant as she spoke. Others say she's trying to warn people to stop them from meeting the same fate. The story sent a chill down Anthony's spine. The idea that Maria's spirit was still wandering that lonely road, searching for something she would never find, was both heartbreaking and terrifying. It made him wonder what he had seen, what he had experienced. Was it really the ghost of Maria Roux? And if so, what did she want from him? As the sun set once again, casting long shadows over the town, Anthony found himself at a crossroads. He could either leave Uniondale and try to put the whole experience behind him, or he could return to the road and face whatever it was that had chosen to reveal itself to him. That night, I made my decision. I couldn't leave Uniondale without confronting the ghost of Maria Roux one last time. I knew it was dangerous, that I was venturing into unknown territory, but the need for answers, for closure, drove me forward. He borrowed a flashlight from the innkeeper and set out for the road just after dusk. The sky was a deep purple, the stars beginning to twinkle in the east as he drove out of town. The road was just as desolate as before, the hills rising up around him like silent sentinels as he made his way back to the spot where he had seen her. As he drove, his heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with anticipation and fear. What would I find? Would she appear to me again, or would I be left alone with the dark memories of that night? When he reached the site, he pulled over and turned off the engine. The silence was deafening, the only sound the soft rustle of the wind through the bushes. He stepped out of the car, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as he scanned the area. For a long time, he saw nothing. The road was empty, the night still and cold. He began to wonder if he had made a mistake, if he had imagined the whole thing. But then, just as he was about to give up, he saw her. She was standing by the side of the road just as before. Her dark hair blew in the wind, her coat fluttering around her like a shroud. Her eyes were fixed on him, her expression one of sorrow and longing. There she was, just as I remembered. What did she want from me? The air was thick with an unspoken tension, the night holding its breath as Anthony and Maria faced each other once more. Anthony's breath caught in his throat as he stared at her, the flashlight trembling in his hand. She looked so real, so solid, yet he knew she couldn't be. The cold air pressed in on him, and that strange scent filled his nostrils again, the same delicate fragrance that had filled his car. He took a step forward, his voice catching in his throat as he tried to speak. "Maria, what do you want from me?" She didn't answer, but her eyes seemed to bore into him, her gaze filled with a pain that he couldn't comprehend. He felt a wave of emotion wash over him, a deep sadness that seemed to come from nowhere. It was as if her sorrow was reaching out to him, pulling him into her world of loss and despair. "I'm sorry for what happened to you," Anthony said, his voice trembling, "but I don't understand. Why me? Why did you appear to me?" For a moment she said nothing, her gaze never wavering. Then slowly, she raised her hand and pointed down the road, her eyes filled with a desperate plea. Anthony turned to look in the direction she was pointing, his heart racing. The road stretched out into the darkness, empty and silent. But as he stared into the night, he felt a sudden urge to follow her, to walk down that road and see where it led. Without thinking, he began to move forward, his footsteps echoing on the asphalt as he made his way down the road. The night closed in around him, the darkness pressing in on all sides as he walked. The cold air bit at his skin, and that strange scent grew stronger with each step. He didn't know how long he walked or how far he went. Time seemed to lose all meaning as he moved through the night, his mind focused on the figure that appeared and disappeared like a mirage in the darkness. Finally, he saw it, the wreckage of a car, half buried in the underbrush by the side of the road. The metal was twisted and rusted, the windows shattered, the tires flat and covered in dirt. The car had been there for years, abandoned and forgotten, a silent monument to the tragedy that had occurred on this lonely stretch of road. Anthony's breath caught in his throat as he approached the wreckage, his heart pounding in his chest. The cold air seemed to grow even colder, almost overwhelming as he stared at the car. He knew, without a doubt, that this was the car Maria had died in. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. The moment he touched it, a wave of emotion washed over him, a flood of sorrow and despair that nearly brought him to his knees. He saw flashes of images, Maria laughing, her fiancé smiling at her, the two of them driving down this very road on that fateful night. And then, the crash. The sound of metal crunching, the scream of tires, the sudden jolt as the car veered off the road and slammed into the hillside. He saw Maria's face, her eyes wide with fear, her hand reaching out to her fiancé in a desperate plea for help. But it was too late. The car rolled, the world spinning in a blur of motion, and then darkness. The vision faded, leaving Anthony gasping for breath, his heart racing with the intensity of what he had just experienced. He staggered back, his hand clutching his chest as he tried to steady himself. The car was just a wreck, a pile of twisted metal and broken glass. But the memory of what had happened here, the pain and fear that had been imprinted on this place, was still very real. He turned back to where Maria had been standing, but she was gone. The road was empty, the night silent once more, but her scent still lingered in the air, a ghostly reminder of the encounter that had changed his life forever. Anthony knew in that moment that he had found the answers he had been searching for. Maria wasn't looking for her fiancé. She wasn't trying to warn people. She was trying to find peace, to come to terms with what had happened to her, and in some strange way, she had chosen him to help her do that. He stood there for a long time, staring at the wreckage, the weight of the night pressing down on him. Finally, he turned and began the long walk back to his car. The cold air bit at his skin, and the strange scent slowly faded as he left the site behind. But the memory of Maria and the encounter that had brought them together on that night in January of 1976 would stay with him forever. The Ghost of Uniondale has been around for decades and has become infamous all over South Africa. Sightings as recent as this year keep getting reported, and although the story is an old one, the experience is still very real and very frightening to each and every person that goes through it. In January of 2024, another traveler, Danny Nod, reported a similar incident where he picked up a hitchhiker who disappeared from his car shortly after entering. He described feeling a sudden cold and hearing faint laughter right before the woman vanished. Like Anthony, Danny too was visibly shaken up, questioning his own sanity. And that brings us to the end of this edition. Thank you again for joining us, and we truly hope you enjoyed the experience. And if you enjoyed a good scary story, do yourself a favor and check out this story about a truly terrifying experience a lone camper had when she went on a solo camping trip at the Pogo Camping Ground in the Appalachian Mountain Range. Stay safe and God bless.